Hello, welcome to the EASL Studio, your weekly hepatology broadcast news. In today's episode, we will focus on the treatment of hepatocellular carcinoma, and we will welcome a new kid on the block. I have the pleasure to share the studio today with María Reig from Barcelona, Helen Reeves from Newcastle, and Umberto Cillo from Padua. And what we are going to speak about is changes in the way we treat patients with HCC and specifically on how we allocate treatment decisions. And I will remind you about this later on as well, but this is all based on work that has been recently published in the Journal of Hepatology about the merits and boundaries of BCLC staging and treatment algorithm, learning from the past to improve the future with a novel proposal. And this is a paper that was published under the expert opinion section. And it provides the expert opinion for from a number of very well-known leaders on the field. And Umberto was one of them, indeed, the senior author. So my first question will go to Umberto, because at the end of the day, why did you think that there was a need for a different approach to the therapeutic decision-making process in hepatocellular carcinoma?
Well, thank you, Bruno. And let me just a second thank also the EASL for this opportunity. I think this is a very fascinating topic, very needed to go into the detail and explanation of which are our proposals on the table now. I think that of course, I have to remind that I'm here again on behalf of Alessandro Vitale, Franco Trevisani, Dr. Park. I want to mention everybody, Professor Cuto and Professor Pinato, and of course myself. And this is a nice group of people that has been fundamental to create this expert opinion. Now, why this? I think one single element which is fundamental is that we were felt uncomfortable in treating our patients with an algorithmic approach. You know, the dichotomic approach that has been used for so many years, and which is, you know, in the basis, the conceptual basis of the BCLC, but also other approaches like in the Far East, is tricky in the sense that it is not the best way to face huge, wide heterogeneity like the one that we face every day in an hepatocellular carcinoma patient. I don't need to recall how the patient are heterogeneous from the oncological point of view. Gene profiling is now showing incredible horizons from the, you know, general condition, from response to therapy, from, you know, every single aspect, and I would say fundamentally from the liver reserve that is behind. I don't think, and I would like to have your opinion, that there are any other oncologic situation that has the same complexity as a hepatocellular carcinoma patient on cirrhosis, at least. So this enormous heterogeneity, which is also intra-patient, because when you see a patient today is not the same patient when you go down his or her history down below months or years, you know, also because of heterogeneity of development of the tumor. So I don't think that this simplistic approach with an algorithmic, decision-making process may face such a complexity. So our answer to that is that, first of all, we need to have a multi-parametric analysis. We need to give a prognostic weight to each particular parameters that is playing a role, from general condition of the patient, tumor burden, biology, and, you know, liver function that is a reserve, and even logistic situation, and we'll go into the detail of this, in order to put everything together, interface with this, and having a response in terms of therapy. This is the only way to do. Otherwise, you risk to have a simplistic approach, and this in non-expert hands may be very dangerous in a way, because the more simple an approach is, the more, you know, risk for undertreatment there is in the general population. So this is a major point. And to face this heterogeneity, and I'm closing then giving to you back, we think that fundamentally this is the very first part of the revolution we are proposing, that we need to have in every single case a personalized approach which is governed by a multidisciplinary expert setting, which is the only one that has the capability to manage and to weight so far the different prognostic values of the different parameters in playing and to take into consideration.
And Umberto, how was the process? How did you reach the proposal that you made? What was this something that was reflecting the multidisciplinary approach to making decisions, or was there any other process? And how was evidence integrated? What was the process behind it?
Interesting question. Thank you, Bruno. This goes back, I have to say, I don't want to be too, ambitious, but it's back 20 years, basically. Because in the last 20 years, beside the enormous impact that BCLC had, in our clinical practice, from the very beginning, we realized that there was a kind of detachment between the algorithmic approach and what we do in the clinical practice, in the day-by-day real world. And this has been, shown in the many publications, Roraya, San Giovanni, and Poon, and so on. And this detachment now is better faced by Maria work and colleagues, with some adjustment, and Maria will go and elaborate on that. However, still there is a difference between what is suggested by the BCLC algorithm and what we do in the clinical practice. And then the more we face the patients in a multidisciplinary context, the more we realize that the risk of over-treating patient, which is associated to the therapeutic hierarchy, we will go also into the detail of this if you, Bruno, would like to, is controlled by the different figures in the multidisciplinary setting. Because when I maybe push as a surgeon on liver surgery, there is the oncologist and the pathologist that may downregulate this proposal. So what we are doing here is trying to standardize and to fill with evidence what we are really doing in the clinical practice in the last 20 years, And it has been a long process in order to collect the evidence, to better understand how to organize, in the end of the day, how to simplify in a scheme, the one that we have been proposed in this Journal of Hepatology expert opinion, going in a therapeutic hierarchy in evaluating which is the best therapy to deliver to the patient.
Okay, so Helen, what would you say are the pros and cons of this approach?
Well, I think we've all grown up with the BCLC algorithm, and so we're very familiar with using it. Everybody understands the principle of it, and it's integrated into multidisciplinary team management. And I don't think there's any doubt that it has prognostic benefit. And so when you begin to start a conversation with a patient, and you want to understand what their prognosis is associated with the cancer, we have the data. And I think across different etiologies and countries, people have validated it in that way. The difficulty for me in my practice is that the majority of my patients will have been, who are fit enough to treat, would fall into BCLC category, because they are older patients with comorbidities and perhaps impaired performance status that may or may not be associated with their cancer. And then that's very difficult, because I think the original evidence base, and Maria can comment, to the creation of the BCLC was not so heterogeneous. This was for patients that were fitter with viral hepatitis, perhaps younger patients than the ones that we see now commonly in our clinical practice. And it just becomes less relevant for them. So if we have an algorithm that suggests if you're a particular category that's advanced, that you should be having medical therapy, but you're somebody who may have had a stroke, you've got impaired renal function, and it's a mobility problem, but actually your general fitness and liver function are preserved, perhaps because you haven't got cirrhosis, which is also something outside of the BCLC algorithm. So there are too many variables. And so you ultimately, if you have a patient who's got complex needs, are going to choose the treatment that you think is best for them. And it may actually be a single treatment, something that has the benefit of being a one-off with less problems for the patient with different issues. And so there, it's nice to have some guidance. It may be very obvious if you start with a hierarchy to say, is this patient going to be suitable for a liver transplant or a resection? So very quickly you can work through and suggest that, no, it isn't going to be that. But for me, you would stop then and look at local regional therapies and the different options for patients, regardless of their BCLC category. Acknowledging that some patients may benefit from medical therapies now in a way that was never possible before, but there are the side effects associated with those treatments, which are continuous. So you need to think individually for each patient, the benefits of the different treatments that are out there and the impact that the treatment will have on the person.
And Maria, similar question for you. What would you think will be the pros and the cons of the approach we're talking about?
Also, thanks, EASL, for inviting me to be here. This is an amazing topic, and I believe that all of us have the same problem. We have an unmet need. We want to have an algorithm for this specific patient, and this algorithm need to have many factors that is impossible to have in a single algorithm, regardless of the thing. Keep in mind that we are managed complexity. I believe that the BCLC, as Helen mentioned before, is something that we could characterize the patient in terms of prognosis. And then we move on to the clinical decision making. As Umberto mentioned, this is something that we did in the last version. We connect the evidence base with the clinical practice. And when I read the publication from Umberto and colleagues, I believe that we are trying to find the same, to characterize what is the best option for these patients and to find a point that is in the middle. My answer is a question. So when you follow the BCLC, do you also apply the treatment state migration and treatment progression? If the answer is yes, I believe that we are speaking about the same language. So the pros for the BCLC, from my understanding, is the linkage between prognosis and treatment. And the last version also include this chapter that is clinical decision making and the red box. This is my favorite one because give all the responsibility for the tumor board. The tumor board is responsible for these specific patients. So the hierarchy proposal is interesting, but I also find the same limitation that we can see in the BCLC. How do you manage, for example, the cost-effective analysis in this country or in the other? That's why I believe that everybody are in the same page. Everybody needs something for a specific patient, but we do not have only one algorithm for everybody. The hierarchy approach, in my understanding, is similar to the clinical decision-making approach, but a different way to present the same because it's used the performance status, it's using the biomarker as we use in the prognostic chapter at the beginning, and some conditions related to the tumor location or the tumor burden. So that's why I don't see exactly what is the main difference regardless of the presentation.
And so maybe this comes to my mind, probably the idea is that things have become, fortunately, for HCC patients, much more complex than they were. We come from an era where only a minority could be resected, true minority. There was no systemic therapy at all, and now we have systemic therapy for a large population of patients at some time point, and we have also the possibility to have curative intent procedures for more patients, including patients that are bridged from more advanced disease. And so at the end of the day, we have to manage the gaps in strong scientific evidence if we compare with other tumor types. What would be, Umberto, if I may come back to you, what would be, when you have performed the analysis to come with this proposal, what were the areas where you found less supporting evidence? So therefore, areas where we should try to provide strong evidence in the future.
Now, let me first come back to Maria for a second. I agree that we are managing the same needs, but we are not on the same page, I think. Why? For a fundamental difference here, that we underline the issue that therapy has an independent prognostic relevance on hepatocellular carcinoma patient, which is totally independent from stage. This distance between stage and therapy as prognostic factors, and this has been shown massively also in big data analysis, is relevant because in each particular stage, well, on one side, the BCLC gives the algorithmic preferred choice and maybe also giving alternatives, but at the end of the day, leads you to a preferred choice, intermediate stage TACE, for example. No? Of course, the multidisciplinary team may modify that decision, but that is the algorithm. We say a totally different thing. We say for each particular stage and independently from the stage, you are supposed to mandatorily to exclude the feasibility of the best therapy possible going in a hierarchical way. This is not banal because it promotes increase of potentially treatable and potentially radical therapy adoption if compared to the stage migration approach, where it gives you the main indication and then leaves to the multidisciplinary team to move on one side or the other. And in Maria paper, there is a more prone approach to go from left to right, in other words, to go from potentially radical down to systemic therapies. We say exactly the opposite, if I may conclude. Whenever you have a patient, let's stay on intermediate stage because it's the more complex and more heterogeneous, please consider if transplant is feasible according to a number of parameters you take into consideration, and we standardize the approach that the multidisciplinary group has to take, starting from general condition, which is not underlined enough in BCLC, going to biology of the tumor, going to the technical feasibility location, and finally even considering patient preferences and logistic. So we give also a standardized approach. Once you have defined that liver transplantation is not feasible because the patient is 90 years old or whatever, then you go mandatorily to the second, in hierarchy, which is laparoscopic liver resection, and then going down to this approach is a guidance, but gives to the multidisciplinary team the rule to, establish the feasibility of the best therapy in a very peculiar and hierarchical order. I don't know if I am able to explain. So, of course, the multidisciplinary team, as you mentioned, Maria, has this possibility, but in the end of the day, in particular in non-super expert hands, people is going to be prone to adapt and to adopt the suggested therapy for that particular stage. We say a different thing. Don't take a look for the stage for a moment and explore the feasibility of the best therapy, starting from transplantation and going down to systemic therapy.
If I make a comment in these things,
please.
I believe that this is still a transgenerational inertia from the reshit version of the BCLC at the beginning, because the last version have a specific note that if the patient is candidate for liver transplantation, this is the fair option as per definition. And that's why now the liver transplantation is not only for the early stage, it's also included for the intermediate stage and so on. And when I say that we are on the same page, It's because the fair option is liver transplantation, depends on the tumor burden, the characteristic, we select another thing. But if you only focus on treatment, you are missing the patient. So if you see the last version of the BCLC staging system, liver transplantation is the fair option. Resection for specific patients is also an option if the patient present a tumor, portal hypertension. And at the end of the day, the hierarchy proposal also considered the same factor. When I saw the figure, I say, okay, BCLC is in this direction. The multi-parametric approach present the BCLC in this direction. So the light is hiding me, sorry. That's why I think that we are in the same page according to the unmet need. And I still believe that the patient is in the center. If you manage the patient according to the treatment, the patient will lose the opportunity to have the best option. And as I mentioned before, the feasibility of the treatment, the availability of the treatment is beyond the liver resection, beyond the liver transplantation. And that's why I still believe that depends as we present in different way, we are in the same page in terms of the best option for each patient.
Let me go beyond the debate, because this would be otherwise an endless debate on pros and cons. I think let me go back to the initial question, which is what we've learned with this is that there are gaps in our knowledge that prevent us to make decisions that are based on the strongest evidence, which is a randomized clinical trial, which we only have for a number of situations. So, Helen, let me ask a question. What would you feel would be the most important unmet needs in terms of scientific evidence that we need to pursue in the coming years, looking to the future?
May I be provocative, Bruno?
Yeah,
sorry. Go ahead with whatever.
That was my question for Helen. So,
sorry.
I mean, I think the difficulty has been mentioned by both Umberto and Maria, and it is the lack of knowledge that we have of using the right treatment for the right patient. And so it's the ability to predict how somebody is going to respond to a treatment, which isn't just about the stage of the tumor. And it's a challenge if we aren't collecting the data in a systematic way. Randomized controlled trials often have not been the best way to support the basic science research if we haven't been able to collect the samples and all of the information that we need. I actually think that all of us have a responsibility to actually audit our own practice. And if that can be in the context of a clinical trial, like an observational study, where you are collecting data on patients as well as tissues, that is the way to try and take it forward. But if you are going to say, okay, we have the algorithm, we have the guidance, but within the multidisciplinary team, we choose to do this for this particular patient, it is your responsibility to make sure that within your practice, your patients are not coming to harm. So if you're going to do local regional therapy when an algorithm suggests that a patient might benefit from medical therapy, or you're going to use radioembolization, or you're going to have a surgical technique, you need to go back and just make sure what your survival data is compared to what other people see in their own practice and what you might have expected for a patient had they had an alternative therapy. So it isn't something, an audit, you can't really publish an audit in a high impact factor journal. So those sorts of things are not that attractive, but I think they are a requirement in terms of governance for managing patients.
And this takes us looking into the future into a very challenging situation, I believe, which is up to now, both the BCLC update and the new proposal on treatment hierarchy basically consider mutually exclusive forms of therapy. So patients are resected but are not given systemic therapy, or are given systemic therapy but are not resected. And what we're seeing today is that the future is moving to towards combinations, although I don't think we need to go into how strong the evidence is for that. But taking a look into the future, Umberto, how would you see your proposal evolving and integrating the data that we will have from combinations? How would you integrate that into the figure?
Well, the answer is already there, and I suggest everybody in the community to go in and look to the picture in the detail. The arrow on your right side is a converse therapy. So there is a direction with a hierarchy between, potentially radical down to systemic, but the idea is already there that according to the new evidences supporting the possibility to convert, you have important, relevant proportion of patients with a response, then you may upload this patient going through systemic therapy, responding, stable disease or partial disease, objective relative response, and reapplying to potentially radical therapies in order to increase their expected survival. And this is the key factor. The only variable that we have in our hands in order to change the prognosis of these patients is therapy, and is one of the stronger prognosticators. So going from the best hierarchy down and vice versa, if it's the case, through a nice systemic therapy that is producing results and reproposing the patient to a potentially radical, that is the best way to go in the future. And the setting, if I may conclude briefly, is already there for the real future that will be artificial intelligence. Because once you have the possibility by machine learning to give a precise weight to the different multiparametric analysis, and this will be done with the big data analysis on real world data, that is going to solve all your problems, and you will already have the scheme with the weight of each particular parameter in order to create the feasibility for each particular single patient.
And Maria, what is the perspective from the BCLC side? So how do we have now data in the intermediate stage with combinations, adjuvant therapies. How do you plan to integrate this?
I would not do a spoiler for the new version because it is not my responsibility at this moment. But what I can say is, if we think about adjuvant therapy or combination therapy, as per definition, you have to start with one treatment. For example, if the patient is a candidate for adjuvant therapy, you have to decide what treatment you will give, and then you give systemic therapy. And that's why it's important, the prognosis of the patient. Depends on the patient characteristic. You could consider to start with resection plus adjuvant therapy, or you will go to combination therapy, chemoembolization plus immunotherapy. And all of these things is what we have to include and integrate. Having said that, the complexity gives us the responsibility to manage the patient according to two levels. And it is a dynamic thing. Maybe a patient could start with resection, for example, then you add immunotherapy and this patient develop progression. It's impossible to have this in only one fixed figure. And that's why we apply the clinical decision-making again, and we will play in this area, because as per definition, you have to start with one option. And depends on the response, you can move to the others.
So that will be a real challenge. And Helen, we've been discussing about how to integrate comorbidities and the different things that make the clinical scenario for individual patients. How about patient preferences? Would you integrate that into any algorithm?
And I think we all use the term holistic. And so this means that we've considered everybody's opinion, and it includes the patient. And I think some patients will not engage in a conversation, and they will just say, you know more than me, doctor. I trust you, I'm in your hands. So there are those patients. But increasingly there are patients who come, and it might be, their family, their children with the mobile phone, and they've searched this and they've searched that. And I think the hierarchical approach is one which the patients appreciate because even if the person is 90 and they've got advanced cancer, the patient and the family will say, why can't I have a liver transplant? They are asked the question. So I think it's just a conversation that you're going to have with the patient. And I think it's very important because patients choose treatments on things that we might not think are important. And one of them might be, and it's the same for taking part in a clinical trial. It's how far away do I live from the hospital? How much does the taxi cost? How many times will I have to come? Will I be able to come on my own? Can I bring my husband? And so they may prefer to actually have one treatment. Or you might have your medical therapy options and they might choose the tablet because they don't have to come to the hospital and it doesn't sound so bad and they don't like the sound of the infusion. And actually neither of them is going to cure me, doctor. So I'd prefer to stay at home with a tablet and not come to your specialist center and have some fancy treatment. I think you have to just have the conversation with the patients and tell them the fact that how likely they are to be cured or not, what their expected survival is, how important actually, regardless of what treatment you're going to have, staying fit is, being active, looking after themselves, eating the right thing, not drinking alcohol if that's something they can live with for however long they've got left. And then help them choose what's right for them, knowing that actually all of these things have got benefits and side effects.
If I make a comment,
please.
I believe that as Helen mentioned, there are many factors that it is impossible to have in an algorithm. But the algorithm, it is a general recommendation as a framework for working together in a multidisciplinary team. And that's why I still believe that the key thing is the responsibility of the tumor board, and this specific patient have many factors that we will not solve in a recommendation, but we can give a recommendation based on this specific patient. That's why I believe it is key, this connection between evidence for recommendation and then applicability of the recommendation into this specific patient. And that's why the new version of the BCLC have this link that, in my view, it is the main difference as the previous one. And that's why I say that is more dynamic than in the past.
I think we do have, and for our tumor boards, increasingly these days, the outcome will be, if this patient is fit enough, we may consider different therapies to be discussed with the patient because they have a role and they may have benefits. So you may include radioembolization, can be discussed with the patient, and they may be referred to an oncologist to talk about medical therapies. So if you think both may have benefits for a particular patient, and one may not be definitely better than the other in some circumstances, that it is something that you include the recommendation, not just being one thing to discuss with the patient and their family.
May Bruno add on this? Thank you, Helen, because it's a crucial point here. That's the reason why we are against an algorithmic approach, because when you have to explain, one of the reasons why, when you have to explain to the patient, you already underlined this, Helen, it's very easy to, and this is what we do in a clinical day-by-day practice, say, listen, there are this option hierarchically driven, and this, if this is fit for you, this is maybe associated to a better prognosis, but the price is this, this, and that. And the alternative is this one with a lesser perspective in terms of survival, or this associated, complication. Is very easy from the value-based point of view, from a patient perspective, to understand which are the options and which are the best option in terms of prognosis. So in terms of explicability, is much more patient-oriented than an algorithm when the patient feels to be driven according to dichotomical variables and is not anymore protagonist. In the opposite around, you have all the options, therapeutic option, and then you can choose with the patient, explaining pros and cons and risk-benefit ratio of each particular setting in terms of therapy available for that particular patient.
That's such an interesting debate. We are coming to the end of our EASL Studio, but I would not like to finish without asking you, each of you, a very short question. Whenever I see the BCLC, or now the therapeutic hierarchy algorithm, or figure, not algorithm, again, as I mentioned before, I see the lack of evidence for certain areas behind it. So my specific question to each and one of you would be, if you would have the opportunity to choose one clinical scenario where you could have the opportunity to bring strong supporting evidence that we lack, what would be that clinical scenario? Umberto, please.
Well, a non-profit scenario, because what we are facing now is a tackle in the direction of very strong evidences provided by randomized clinical trial where a single drug is changed, and you know, the setting and the design is very easy to follow and to realize, is totally the opposite when you have a complex process like multi-complex procedure like surgery or combined therapy, ablation, laparoscopic and laparoscopic resection, or tear and preparing regeneration. Oh, that is so difficult to describe in a random.
So that would be early stages, let's say.
Well,
early stages of the disease.
Well, I would say no. I would say BCLC B and C.
Okay.
With potentially radical therapy.
Okay.
Is, you know, bring those patients, select those patients to the best therapy. This is what is lacking, because that field, that group of patients is very easily covered by profit research, and they are very efficient. We are not, and this is an imbalance in terms of even editorial kind of problem. And
Helen, what would be your choice?
I think for me, if you go to advanced therapies and medical therapies, I think the difficulty we face is that the industry are using drugs and doing trials with combinations of different things before we understand them. And this is the way that oncology practice works. But it means that, you know, the researchers spend years finding out what's a predictive biomarker for sorafenib, or for atezo-bev. And by the time you find something, actually, there's a different treatment on the block that somebody is now using. And I think we need to find predictive biomarkers for classes of therapies so that we can understand who responds to a kinase inhibitor, who responds to checkpoint inhibitors, who responds to bevacizumab, or those kinds of classes, so that we have a better idea of who is going to do well with an individual therapy before we start to combine them. And so I think it's the biomarkers that I want, the predictive biomarkers, but not for one combination, when by the time you know what it is, you've moved on to something else.
That would save a lot of money as well. So Maria?
I address Helen's comment about biomarker, and if I think about HCC management, the unmet need is how do you manage a patient who develop progression after immunotherapy, regardless of the stage. If we have to continue with second line, for example, with systemic therapy, or we could consider local regional treatment in this setting. So in the setting of intermediate advanced stage, the sequencing is an unmet need. In the early stage, I have to say again, what is the real impact of the immunotherapy in this population, and how do you proceed with the sequences? So only one word, sequences in the setting of HCC.
Excellent.
I don't know
we are certain.
Biological markers of cancer aggressiveness is one unmet need that is fundamental in every stage, basically, because you can deliver potentially radical approaches provided that the patient has a biology which is permitting. And this is the key point. Otherwise, we are going to treat with systemic therapy everybody.
Yes, we need to know what the disease is, not what the disease looks like. Not always. This was an outstanding debate. I would like to thank all of you, Umberto, Maria, and Helen, for a very nice discussion. I'm sure the audience will have enjoyed it. And in the next episode of the EASL Studio, our experts will discuss the critical significance of integrating patient perspectives in hepatology, unveiling practical steps to involve patients in research. And also, remember, please, to become a member and join the EASL family.